This is actually a very interesting panel. We are segueing from the discussion of the superpowers of the world, of the great powers, into the second tier of powers from at the periphery of the Gulf region, a second tier of powerful countries who've had a very interesting and somewhat complex relationship with the Gulf and with each other. Again, as Mr. Constantine said, I'd like to note with appreciation the collaboration on this panel with the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Somebody, I think it was Rahman, said every crisis offers an opportunity, but it's who takes that opportunity. The drama in Gaza may be playing out on a narrow strip no more than 450 kilometers in area, but its ramifications are already being felt beyond the region. All three of these powers, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, interact with one another and with the states of the Gulf in very complex ways. Israel and Turkey, until the last decade, were the closest of allies in the Eastern Mediterranean. Iran was one of the first Muslim countries to open diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. Even after the revolution that overthrew Israel's friend, Shah Mohammad Reza, the new Islamic Republic and Israel found numerous somewhat clandestine opportunities to cooperate with each other. For those of us old enough to remember, the most notorious being the Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan administration. Now, Israel and Turkey engage in shouting matches and personal vilification between leaders while keeping open the possibility of cooperation on gas and oil pipelines. Turkey and Iran have always had an on-again, off-again rivalry in the region, whether cooperating against Kurdish separatists, competing in Iraq, and combining forces to save Qatar at the start of the famous blockade in 2017. What happens next as a result of the Gaza crisis? Does popular revulsion in Turkey at the images coming out of Gaza make future reconciliation between Ankara and Jerusalem impossible and therefore lead to greater Turkish intervention against Israeli interests in the region? Turkey seems to have embarked on an anti-Western course. Does this course drive it closer to Iran, or does it increase their centuries-old competition for power and influence in Mesopotamia and in the Gulf? Does Israel achieve its goal of forcing an armed confrontation between the United States and Iran, as many believed 20 years ago occurred in Iraq? These are important questions for which I have no obvious answer. One of the most depressing things the last few years is my experience now convinces me that I have no idea what's going to happen next in the region. But how these rivalries play out will have serious consequences for the states of the Gulf region and beyond. One can even imagine the interaction between these three states leading to serious harm to American interests as we compete with the other outside powers, with Russia and China. To provide greater insight and clarity into this murkiest of subjects, we have assembled as good a group of experts as I could imagine here today. Running through their bios, Dr. Abdulla Baabood, who unfortunately is here only virtually today, is an academic from Oman currently holding the chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies and a visiting professor at the Faculty of International Research and Education, Waseda University, Tokyo, Japan. Abdulla taught at different universities and institutions in Europe and the Gulf and was a visiting professor at the Middle East National University of Singapore, College of Humanities, and his academic credentials go on and on for another page. Dr. Roxane Farmanfarmaian is the Director of International Studies and Global Politics at the University of Cambridge's Institute for Continuing Education. She is also a Senior Research Fellow at King College London, a founding member of the Center for the International Relations of the Middle East, and editor of the Cambridge Review of International Affairs. Jonathan Lord, our third speaker, is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Prior to joining CNIS, Mr. Lord served as a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee, serving the full committee and managing the U.S. Central Command Middle East Defense Policy portfolio and issues related to security assistance, and is Iraq Country Director in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Our fourth speaker, Mr. Omar Rahman, is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, where he focuses on Palestine, Middle East, geopolitics, and American foreign policy in the region. The editor of Afkar, the Council's online publication, providing insights and analysis on current events in the region. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy, visiting at Brookings, Doha, where he has written about Palestine and Israel. I regret to say that our fourth speaker, Dr. Gunul Tol, who was absent today because of illness. She was the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program. I will ask the members of our panel if they would each address the Turkish issue in their comments as well. So thank you very much. Let's begin. Dr. Baabood.
Thank you very much. It's good morning to you. Good evening from my side. I'm actually in Muscat at the moment. I apologize. I couldn't be with you in person as much as I wanted to. I took a flight from Tokyo to Oman, connecting to Washington, and I had issues with my visa, unfortunately, and hopefully it will be resolved in the future so I could be with you in future events. And I want to thank you very much for the kind invitation to join you in this panel with these distinguished speakers. And thank you for the kind introduction. I just wanted to say that from a Gulf perspective, from a GCC perspective, the Gulf states have been having some informal exchange and informal relations with Israel that goes back a long time. This relationship has now come to the forefront of course, with the Abraham Accord. But even beyond that, other countries that did not sign the Abraham Accord that always had relationship with Israel, with the idea that, you know, the Oslo peace process and what started from there was going to have a two-state solution, and we're going to have peace and cooperation in the region. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and as we know, some countries started to downgrade their relationship. For example, Qatar opened a trade office, Oman did the same thing, and there were a lot of visits, etc., trying to encourage Israel that a two-state solution and resolution of the Palestinian conflict could be beneficial for all parties. And we have no implication or no problem in dealing with Israel and accepting Israel. And of course, beyond that, one also has to consider the Arab peace plan that had called for a two-state solution, again, going with the international resolution and accepting Israel and accepting, opening relationship with not just the Arab countries, but all the Muslim countries. As you know, Israel did not want to do this. It made the two-state solution almost impossible because of its settlement policies. And of course, it doesn't want to have a one-state solution because, it wants to see it as a purely Jewish state. And that obviously has created a problem. And the Gaza conflict now, the Gaza war, has erupted because we know that you can't keep people under occupation, you can't keep people intimidating people for a long time, and they have the right to resist. However, one can question what Hamas did, but that is part of what people under occupation can do. We can agree or disagree with what happened, but that is that we are now faced with that an unfortunate and really sad situation, and we are seeing atrocities being committed now against the Palestinian and collective punishment against them. unfortunately, this is going to have a huge implication for the future of the relationship and the peace process. I know that people and some of the leaders are now waking up to the fact that, we have to have a two-state solutions. But I think maybe, in my opinion, it's a bit late. A bit late in the sense that, because of the Israeli policies of extending settlements in the West Bank. It's a bit late because now, the Palestinians are in no mood to start talking about that. They've got wounds, deep wounds to heal, and it's going to take a long time for that to happen. And I think this is going to have really bad implication for any further normalization. And I believe that some of the countries that have normalized are now under pressure. And I think I don't think they'll change their policies in that sense, but I think they are embarrassed with what they have done. So I think that the peace process is going to take a long time, and it's not going to be as easy as people now started to call for, and some leaders are calling for. For the Gulf states, I can see that there isn't one opinion about the war. I mean, all of them are condemning the war, condemning the violence, and calling for a peaceful resolution, etc. But there is nuanced differences between them. We see that Kuwait, Qatar, Oman are much more sympathetic with the Palestinians, where we see that Saudi Arabia and UAE, Bahrain are a little bit quieter in this regard, although they called for a ceasefire and they called for a two-state solution or resolution of the Palestinian conflict. But there are nuanced differences between them, and we have to take that into consideration. As far as the public opinion in the Gulf states, I think that also goes along with the official position of these countries. So we've seen demonstrations happening in Kuwait. We've seen, public outrage in Kuwait and Qatar, in Oman as well. The public sentiment is very high in these countries. They are against the war. They are against what they see as Israeli atrocities committed against the Palestinians, and they can't avoid the images that they see on the TV screens, and it's of course very nasty, and I think everybody is alarmed by that. There isn't like anything that shows public opinion polls or anything like that, but what we see from social media, we see that people are very, very angry. And the other countries, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and UAE, I think, again, there is a mixture. Saudi Arabia, there are more people asking. There are a lot of people asking or condemning the war and condemning what Israel is doing. But also, many of them are quiet because, they don't want to embarrass their own government, which did not go a long way in condemning Israel. In Bahrain and UAE, again, embarrassed by the Abraham Accord, and I think the public understand that they don't want to embarrass their government, and as you know, public opinion here is highly controlled by governments in most cases. So difficult to tell, but from what we see in social media, there are a lot of people are angry, not only in the Gulf, but also across the Arab world and across the Muslim world because of the what they see as a Gaza genocide committed by Israel. I think another thing you want to talk about is, of course, the position of Iran. Iran is basically in a very difficult position. In a way, it is one of the supporters of Hamas, despite the fact there is an ideological issues between the two. Iran also supports Hezbollah support the Houthis in Yemen, and also supports the Syrian regime. Iran had declared that it's not part of this war and it did not instigate it. At least officially, this is what we've heard. And it tried to distance itself. Yet it is giving signals that if this war was to continue and the devastation to Gaza is going to continue, it's warning that there could be a regional war or conflagration in that regard. In that sense, Iran has, as I said, that it has like supporters, or it has through its own forward defense policies, where it has Hezbollah and other groups. It can create havoc as well in the region. But I think it is wisely calculating that this could lead to further regional conflict that can go beyond all imagination. Signs from Israel that they're gonna, not only destroy Hezbollah but also the whole of Lebanon, I think sends a message. The U.S. Sending its own armament to the region as well sends a message. So I think Iran is rather careful not to get too implicated in this war. Although we've seen some exchange between Hezbollah and Israel, but it is within the acceptable, as it were, conduct of conflict between them. We've seen some also missiles being fired by the Houthis, but again within a low range, as it were, and not leading to any further implications. And we've seen something that is happening, of course, in Iraq and Syria, attacking U.S. related interests. But only, I believe that these are just messages being sent to the United States and to Israel, that the further this war continues, the further the atrocities are being committed, this could lead to an even larger conflict, which I think the region doesn't want to see that. As you know, the Gulf states are now embarking on economic development, on diversification, and on their visions, and they want to focus on that. And I think no one in the region wants to see yet another regional war or another conflict that goes beyond what is happening. And I think everybody, at the end of the day, is calling for a ceasefire and trying to resolve this conflict, however difficult that may be. And we've seen, of course, the meeting in Saudi Arabia of the Arab and Islamic countries, again calling for that. At the end of the day, I think people want peace, and they want people are accepting to live with Israel. If Israel wants to accept that, that to give the Palestinian rights that are enshrined under the United Nations and the Council, United Nations Council resolutions. And of course, there is the Arab peace plan that was already put on the table. I think this is going to be their position. And I will end, if I may, by saying that Saudi Arabia, as you know, was, many people were talking about Saudi-Israel normalization. The process was, going, and there were reports that it was coming towards some kind of a conclusion. This is going to affect that, obviously, in a big way. I think what has happened this war, however we look at it and however we condemn all kinds of violence, I think this war is brought the Palestinian question to the forefront of the Arab countries, of the Muslim countries, but also globally. It's going to affect not only the region, but also beyond the region. I think this is also, if it's not stopped and if it's not contained and we don't find a solution to this, I think my worry, this is going to lead to further radicalization in the region and further resentments to what people see as Western support, unconditional Western support to Israel. And I think this is, in the long run, is going, or at least started to lead to where the public opinion is now, questioning Western, particularly U.S. policies in the region. And I think we need to be careful not to lose the Arab public, and also not to lose the countries in the region, because the United States is also facing other competition, global competition, and the region is important to it. So I think what the people are really looking for is a balanced approach from the United States to this conflict, where first of all, stopping the war and the atrocities, and secondly, trying to work with everybody, with all the countries in the region, to find a lasting solution for conflicts like this not to be seen again. Otherwise, we will just go from one conflict to the other, and it will be an end, unfortunately, unless the Palestinian question is resolved once and for all. Let me end there, and happy to answer any questions. And as I said, I'm sorry I'm not with you physically. I really miss that.
Dr. Baabood, thank you very much. If I could ask, because I know that you know a great deal about the subject, if you could also address a little bit about the role that Turkey has played and could play in the region in the future.
Well, as you know, there's been a very, very strong condemnation from Iran and from Turkey. And I think this is embarrassing some of the Arab countries, at least, that have not, used the same language. Turkey is, of course, since you asked this question, Turkey is a very important country, and it's an ally of the West, part of NATO, and Turkey has an important role. Good relationship, good working relationship with Israel, and also Turkey has its own relationship, of course, with the Palestinians and the Arab countries. I think Turkey can be used, and the office of and the efforts of Turkey can be used to help resolve these conflicts. My worry, excuse me, if I may say that, is that this conflict is yet leading to empowerment of Turkey and Iran in the region amongst the Arab public. That this is going to where the public opinion are seeing that Turkey is supporting the Palestinians in a very strong way. They see that Iran is doing that, and they see that the Arab countries, or at least some of them, especially the influential ones, are not doing as much as they should do. And this could lead to further alienation of the public and more support for Turkey and Iran in the region. I think these two non-Arab countries could be the winners, if that is something we could say, at least as far as the public are concerned. This is what I hear from the people I talk to. They're really praising Turkey, praising Iran for their stand, and they're condemning some of the Arab countries' stand and the way that they have not been as forceful as Turkey and Iran. And I think Turkey has a very important role, despite the strong condemnation from Turkey. I think it can play a very important role, because it's a very important Mediterranean country. It's a neighboring country to many Arab countries, and has good relationship, working relationship, economic relationship with Israel, and also with Arab countries. And I think more attention should be given to their role in the future, in the future of resolving this conflict. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much for stepping into the gap there. Dr. Roxane?
Thank you very much for inviting me and including me. And Abdullah, we certainly miss seeing you in person, hopefully next time.
I miss you so much.
So I'm going to be speaking, the questions that were posed to me is the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the face of the current crisis, as well as in the longer term. And I would argue that the relationship between the two of them is in a delicate phase for three reasons. Their own national and bilateral position. Number two, their role vis-a-vis Gaza, obviously, and the war. And thirdly, their own position within the dynamics of the region. And let me break those down. The first one about looking at their own national and bilateral relationship in itself. They are forging a new détente, the stability of which is far from guaranteed at the moment. MBS and President Raisi sat down very publicly in Riyadh over the last 10 days at the Organization for Islamic Countries meeting, showing that they had a common interest and were vested in being seen as friendly and constructive. However, this statement that each issued out afterwards could not have been more contrasting. And indeed, I think we see that they reflected each country's ideological perspective as well as strategies going forward. However, I think it was also very interesting that they were able to live with each other's statements and that those statements reflected a pragmatism rather than conflict. Saudi's statement was, of course, softer, showing a statesmanlike stance that would keep the US and Israel on side whilst presenting strong support for the Palestinians and a ceasefire. Iran, on the other hand, demanded severance of all relations with Israel among the members of that meeting, including cutting Israel's energy supplies, and of course came out strongly in support of Hamas. I would argue that the differences are beneficial to them both, as long as they do not directly threaten each other. Iran's muscular anti-Israel, anti-US stance has been part of a 40-year narrative that has consistently appealed to the Arab street. I would agree with your point, Abdullah. This is actually perhaps going to be a new phase of representing the populations in a way that could become increasingly uncomfortable for the leaders of the Gulf. That population in the streets of the Arab world are incensed at the moment in a way we haven't seen for a long time by Israel's degree of retaliation and aggression, which Iran simply has to highlight to bring home, and which, in fact, Saudi was unable to speak to with such directness if it is to keep its diplomatic options open with Israel and the United States. Saudi's more emollient tone, increasingly aligned, of course, with the UAE, however, offers balance to Iran's fiery position, which provides Tehran cover, on the other hand, for acting somewhat less adventurously than its rhetoric would imply, and giving it time to consider whether and how it's prepared to expand the conflict. Both Saudi and Iran are committed to maintaining good relations between the two of them because of their own respective economic needs, which has been addressed by several people already here. Saudi's Vision 2030 and Iran's plans to reverse its domestic economic woes, both of which would, of course, suffer considerably were conflict to break out in the Gulf. To the second point, the relationship between them vis-a-vis the Gaza war certainly makes this a more delicate and, in fact, trickier relationship at the moment. The active role that the U.S. has taken, including the arrival of 2 of its naval groups in the region since October 7th, adds significant pressure, as does the increase in U.S. military presence in the Gulf. These are moves that sit quite well with Saudi on the one hand, which has been negotiating security guarantees with the U.S. well before Gaza came up, and which has exhibited in the past some concern at recent signs of growing U.S. engagement in the region. Saudi is under no illusion that the U.S. is now picking its battles in the region. It will no longer be the power that sorts out issues in Sudan, in Syria, in Yemen, for example, leaving that instead to local heavyweights to manage. But its investment in the region, particularly in Saudi and the UAE, of US capital and tech, means that Saudi remains a special relationship where the US will remain seized. And that is simply not something that Saudi is willing to give up, and in fact is encouraging. Saudi has every reason to nurture this unique position, and therefore also to ensure that Israel knows that the conversation there is continuing. Some have suggested that normalization of relations between Saudi and Israel is something Iran simply has had to accept if it is to pursue an alliance with Riyadh. I'm not so sure yet. I would not go so far as to say that there was a collusion between Iran and Hamas to derail the Saudi normalization with Israel as part of the motivation behind the October 7th attack. But in my view, Iran has yet to accept normalization as a given. And as Foreign Minister Abdullahian's initial shuttle diplomacy around the Gulf clearly illustrated, Iran is promoting an alternative, a more consistent and tied-up Muslim position, not only on the Gaza war issue, but on the Palestinian question more generally. Something, of course, that it has yet to achieve, but sees as an effective negotiating point, as an effective balance against both the US and Israel as the conflict goes on. Depending on how restless those populations of the Gulf become, or if the war expands in scope, this could become an increasingly important option for Saudi leadership as well to consider. On the other hand, if Saudi and the UAE and others in the GCC become the bankrollers of Gaza's reconstruction once the war winds down, this would give them enormous clout in determining any solution to the Palestinian issue, eroding Iran's current pillar position and standing on Palestine and being its great supporter. The key role of Iran in promoting increased conflict has been often mentioned. Less mentioned are the huge risks it runs to its reputation, not to mention its own economic health, if it miscalculates how far to push this conflict. And so finally, I'll move on to my last point, which is that the relationship here between the two, as far as the dynamics in the region entirely, is in fact, I would argue, the main tipping point. Saudi and the GCC generally have gradually, I would suggest, come to accept a degree of political presence of the Shia regional leadership, not only in Iran, but crucially in Iraq, and have been making quite some strides in bringing Baghdad, for example, on side into the GCC orbit. Likewise, MBS has learned over the past 10 years, after making several bruising mistakes, including the kidnap of the Lebanese prime minister, the killing of Khashoggi, and the war on Yemen, that there's a great value to greater diplomacy. Bringing the war in Yemen to an end is clearly a priority for Riyadh, and Iran is key to that. At the same time, Iran's network of the resilience fighters, which Saudi has consistently denied as a threat and danger to the region, including in some cases to its own sovereign integrity, are now a crucial element, not only in any escalation of the Gaza war, but in the growing conflict that we're beginning to see between the US and several resilience fighting groups in Syria in particular. Following a meeting this summer, when all the groups of the Resilience Network arrived in Tehran to discuss strategies and hierarchies of command, one of the goals allegedly set out was to refocus on taking back Jerusalem, a city that has witnessed a significant escalation in violence over the last couple of years. For Iran, supporting such work by its proxies gives it useful and important deniability, something we're seeing right now as it stays out of its direct engagement with Gaza, or even indirect engagement as Hezbollah also stays off the stage directly, if in the wings. For Saudis, to accept this resilience access is probably part of its friendlier ties with Iran, and possibly gives it an iota of leverage. First of all, in its ability to object directly to Iran should there be an overuse of the resilience groups, or indeed whether used at all, and at the maximum, some sway in convincing Iran to reduce its use of these proxies, or possibly even reduce the size of those groups out there. The growing number of U.S. attacks on these forces, mainly in Syria, is complicating this calculation, of course, for Saudi. An escalation of the Gaza war would make that calculation even more difficult, as it would likely draw the dividing lines between Iran and Saudi in the Gulf and in the region more starkly. So in sum, prior to the Gaza war, the Gulf appeared to be heading towards a deconflictual period, with the China-brokered Saudi-Iran deal paving the way for warming relations among all those states. The Gaza war has raised the risk of the relationship between Iran and Saudi turning sour, but it is not an inevitability, and for the moment is working as an insurance possibly, or even a hedge against greater conflict. It fulfills also the mutual images they have of themselves as leaders in this region.
Thank you, Dr. Roxane. One question that has intrigued me a bit that was rarely addressed, which is the de-emphasis of Wahhabism and the evangelical aspects of Wahhabism by the Crown Prince, by Mohammed bin Salman. Has that changed any of the dynamics of the region, in your opinion?
From Iran's perspective, I don't think that it has. And that's partially because I think what we're also seeing is that not only is there the tension between Shia and Sunni, which are part of that larger question you're asking me, but there's also the fact that Iran is not unaware of the fact that the Saudis are also reducing the variety of acceptance that it is showing towards different sects within the Sunni grouping themselves. So I think it sees its own position as a Shia supporter as part of a larger picture of where Sunni, Shia, and Muslim dynamics fall. And it has consistently argued that its view is the real enemy is the West, so that the Muslim states should stand together and then resolve their problems afterwards. Now, whether we take that as read or not, that has been its consistent message, and we're seeing it have particular value and valence at times of conflict such as this.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lord.
Thank you. First, I would just like to express my thanks to the Gulf International Forum for the opportunity to be here, particularly to Dr. Danya Thafer, friend, colleague, very esteemed expert, who I respect immensely. And then, of course, to thank my fellow panelists and our esteemed audience, many experts in their own right here, and friends who I've had the opportunity to meet over the course of my time at CNAS and before in my role in government. I understand the issue of the Israel-Palestinian conflict evokes many strong emotional responses, and I come here humbly to represent my analytical views, and I please ask that if you find my views to be analytically dispassionate, not to mistake that for callousness or a lack of understanding or empathy about the toll of human suffering that this conflict has caused and continues to. I've been asked to discuss how could the ongoing Gaza war affect Israel's standing in the Gulf region with both the GCC and Iran, and I suppose now Turkey as well. And how could the current war affect Israel's future relations with Bahrain, the UAE, and normalization prospects with Saudi Arabia? I think it's worth first laying out a little bit of the genesis of the current conflagration, beginning with the attack on October 7th, and perhaps why that attack occurred in the first place. If it is as reported that the planning for that attack began at least a year ago, or roughly a year ago, what was going on in the region to inform the decision-making to launch some sort of attack? Which isn't necessarily to say that it was a year ago that Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif woke up and decided they were going to do exactly what transpired on October 7th, but something was going to come. If you go back a year ago, what we knew then is that at that point, the Abraham Accords were 2 years old. There were negotiations ongoing between Israel, UAE, Israel, and Bahrain that would amount to free trade agreements that would be later signed in January of this past year, I believe. And it had become public information that there was at least one Israeli air defense system, the Barak 8, which is co-produced with India, that had been deployed to the United Arab Emirates for Emirati defense. It would come out by the end of the year that I think UAE would become Israel's 16th largest trading partner in the world. Clearly, over the course of the 2 years since the signing of the Abraham Accords, the world moved very fast in the Middle East. On the economic file, on the security file, relations between Israel and the other signatories of the Abraham Accords were advancing. On the issue of Saudi normalization, myself, and I think many people even more sage than me, considerably more sage than me, the common refrain was post King Salman, we will see normalization occur, but unlikely to occur until that happens. And we would all probably been wrong, because what has transpired in the past year has been really quite surprising, the pace at which those negotiations have come into the limelight and then advanced in a very public way. It was reported just this past March, I think first in the Wall Street Journal, that these negotiations were ongoing. And since then, we had seen a very public approach about first their genesis and what would ultimately come. And in the months leading to the attack, we had seen things that were just absolutely unprecedented, to include the Crown Prince going on American television, talking very openly and bullishly about the future of those negotiations, what they might amount to, shuttle diplomacy from President Biden's closest advisors to Riyadh and Israel. And then, of course, the presence of Israelis in Saudi Arabia itself, first quietly and then under the guise or the construction of the UNESCO event. And then finally, just in the weeks prior to the October 7th attack, Israeli ministers in this government appearing in Saudi Arabia publicly, to include the Minister of Communications, who was photographed in media in Riyadh over the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, praying in Riyadh with all the accoutrement that one would have for that holiday. All quite very public, all demonstrating where this was heading. So I think my belief is that whether or not specifically it was begun under the auspices of understanding normalization with Saudi Arabia coming, or simply because of the general shift in which Israel was being integrated more completely into the region, the planning for this attack and the attack itself was Hamas's attempt to arrest that trend. It is an open question now what happens next, but I believe that normalization, certainly with the countries that have already become signatories to the Abraham Accords, will remain, and I think there is a lot of public evidence to suggest that once the conflict subsides with Hamas, normalization attempts with Saudi Arabia will resume. In part, I think President Biden's response actually, paradoxically, demonstrates exactly what Saudi Arabia hopes to have for itself in a normalization agreement with the US and Israel. And it really is a normalization agreement with the US and Israel. His political rhetoric, which demonstrated he stood shoulder to shoulder with Israel, and then his actual deeds in first steaming the Gerald IV Carrier Strike Group into the Eastern Mediterranean, followed by the Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, 3 squadrons of aircraft, F-15s, F-16s, A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, the movement of the Bataan Amphibious Ready Group carrying the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, an Ohio-class guided missile submarine, a few thousand U.S. troops bringing multiple air defense systems, Patriot batteries, THAAD, Avenger, all demonstrated America's resolve in ensuring that the conflict, which was now ongoing, would not grow. And this was all in an effort to deter other potential entrants from doing so and beginning a larger regional conflagration and opening up new fronts in what was otherwise a limited war. It really served to burnish the credentials and the features and the benefits of what a deal would mean for Riyadh, because it was exactly the response that in Saudi Arabia's moment of crisis it would hope to have from the United States and other Western partners and allies. So in that sense, I do think there remains a likelihood of normalization. For its part, obviously, the images of civilian harm in the Gaza Strip that are ubiquitous in social media and on cable news are an unhelpful pressure, certainly on Saudi Arabia and other states that have relations with Israel. And for its part, Israel could probably speed the return to those negotiations by doing everything it can to limit civilian harm within the Gaza Strip. I think it's worth noting we've also seen, not just in public statements that have been released by Gulf ministers, but then, of course, following Khalid bin Salman's visit to the White House, the statement that came out of the White House that represented a likelihood of return to negotiation once hostilities concluded. But in fact, in Arabic media, particularly Al Arabiya, I think it's worth noting that there have, while been an editorial line that is highly critical of the civilian harm caused by the Israeli Defense Forces, there's also been an effort to lay culpability at the feet of Hamas. And I think one particularly clear example of this was Rasha Nabil's interview with Khalid Mashal, where she asked incredibly pointed questions about Hamas's purpose in this attack, the atrocities it committed, and what it hoped to gain for the region in doing this. So I think that's worth noting as well. When it comes to Iran and perhaps some of the proxies and partners it has in the region, I think there has been clearly a bit of divergence in the force where certain actors have sought to walk a balance beam of attempting to demonstrate enough activity against Israel to show solidarity with Hamas and the axis of resistance while actually not embroiling themselves in a larger conflict. In the past, I've described this effort to escalate as one that exists on a dimmer switch as opposed to just an on and off switch. And that's beneficial in the sense that no one has to be put to any hard political choices if you're escalating on a dimmer switch. And so I think for the Israelis, we've seen that in that there was no one singular moment when they launched a massive ground invasion. Things developed rather steadily. And similarly, on the northern front with Hezbollah, we've seen Hezbollah act in a way that has been a similar slow crescendo, which prevents anyone from having to be painted in a quarter that then sends off a broad war. There are some exceptions, I think, to that a little bit. Looking at the activities of the Iraq-based militias who enjoy support from Iran, I think their incentives are slightly different than those of Hassan Nasrallah. For one, I think perhaps they would enjoy a domestic political incentive in seeing hostilities increase with U.S. forces, particularly if the U.S. can be drawn into attacking them in Iraq itself, which it has thus far not done. but that would create enough political blowback that they could again attempt through the Council of Representatives and by applying public pressure to Prime Minister al-Sudani to throw the U.S. forces out of Iraq, which is ultimately a central goal of theirs. The President Biden has walked a line of responding militarily at certain moments, but has not so far taken the bait to escalate into a broader war with groups like Kataib Hezbollah. It does seem as if Iran itself was caught off guard by the attack of October 7th. So far, what Israel has publicly stated and what the U.S. government has publicly stated is that they have found no intelligence evidence suggesting Iran was complicit specifically in the planning of this attack. Other public reporting that has come out certainly seems to support the assertion that it was planned in a very analog way for the purposes of deceiving intelligence. And therefore, I think we've seen somewhat of a demure approach from Tehran, whereby up to a point, I think the analytical line I would share is that they would enjoy seeing Iran and the U.S. embroiled in a larger conflict with its proxies and partners, but not one that brings direct risk to Iran itself within its own borders or subjects its national sovereignty to threat. And so they, too, seem to be walking a bit of a line. With respect to their level of positive control of various groups that have initiated some degree of escalation, I think the record is mixed. It's often talked about that Qasem Soleimani was the grand architect and controller and conductor of all of this activity outside of Iran's borders. But what I think is often not talked about is that he could be as much a constraining force at times as he was an instigating force. And when he was taken off the battlefield and now replaced with Ismail Ghani as commander of Quds Force, I'm not certain that Iran enjoys the same level of control and influence that it had under Soleimani's reign. And so perhaps some of what is going on, particularly with these Iraqi-based groups, might be about them trying to burnish their own credentials as a truer resistance force than some of their local competitors in the political scene in Iraq. But all that to say is that I remain relatively bullish on regional integration, and the tectonic plates that shifted beginning long before 2020 but came into the public light in and around 2020 will continue. And on October 6th, individuals like myself and my esteemed colleague Omar were having the types of discussions about what would be the Palestinian component of a coming Saudi normalization deal. And I think in many respects that conversation has been inverted, where once open hostilities in the Gaza Strip are over, we might actually see normalization continue pulled through the eye of the pinhead of the Israeli-Palestinian question, and through the creation of some sort of internationalized mechanism, a multinational mechanism that provides governance, security, economic aid to the Gaza Strip and restores a pathway to a two-state solution, Israeli-Saudi normalization might just become a fait accompli. So I think it actually enables normalization to continue perhaps in a different way. And the central piece of it now might be the resumption of a negotiated solution that does in fact seek to create conditions that ultimately ends the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with Gulf states and the Saudis as the imprimatur of that way forward. And I'll pause there, and again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jonathan. One issue that you made a very persuasive case for the likelihood that normalization will continue. I have one question there that has concerned me and doesn't come up very often. How does Gaza end? Because early on, I felt that the Israelis have basically two choices. Choice number one is at some point declare victory and say it's over and pull back to some status quo not dissimilar from the one that preceded October 7th. The second one is to make, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has argued, he will root out, he will eradicate Hamas. And that strikes me as a formula for Israel's forever war, that you can't do it in anything less than a 5 to 10 year campaign involving a couple of 100,000 troops. So what happens if that scenario takes place?
That's an excellent question. I'd be sitting here as a charlatan if I told you I knew what the answer was, but I can tell you that in response to the event of October 7th, it was a watershed moment in Israel politically, such that the status quo of Israel's counterterrorism actions to disable, discombobulate, prevent the projection of terror by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad would be an insufficient answer for the Israeli public. And that, I think, by and large, has driven the ultimate objective that has been stated by Israel, which is both the political and the military dissolution of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. What was being described in those terms is no longer a counterterrorism operation, but one that I would characterize more as a counterinsurgency operation, much more along the lines of what the U.S. has been engaged in the region with partners, most recently in its fight against ISIS. However, as I've stated publicly in other fora, this is much harder for a host of reasons. One, certainly towards the end of its time as a controlling insurgent force, ISIS did not enjoy the same political legitimacy that among locals as Hamas does and continues to. It's much more developed movement. And secondly, the Israelis themselves, I don't think, had any understanding of what a successful counterinsurgent operation would require. And to hear them describe what they plan to do in the earliest days just sounded like a really, really big counterterrorism operation, which I think is why we heard President Biden say so publicly that he was asking the Israelis hard questions. And we saw American military leaders with experience in counterinsurgency come to Israel to try to inform the thinking of Israeli military planners that they should measure twice and cut once before walking themselves into a conflagration with no clear ability to end. So it remains unclear. However, from what I have observed from the outside, the way that the Israelis have prosecuted, particularly the ground incursion, is that it does, for me, have echoes of the Mosul campaign, where they sought to first clear territory on the periphery of the central hubs of insurgent control, and then clear deliberately step by step while attempting, with both U.S. and public and international pressure, to hold open corridors for the exfiltration of civilians. So in that sense, it does to me resemble what we have seen in Mosul, but of course there are many complicating factors for which I'm not sure the Israelis themselves yet have answers. They're doing immense amounts of ground clearance, but there is no simple solution to clearing the tunnel system, which is reportedly 300 miles long and extends throughout and underneath large swaths of highly dense population centers. And as we saw, as what occurred in Jabalia, any sort of attack on the tunnel system in those areas will create immense civilian harm above ground. And so I think those questions are being answered, but I do believe that there remains a degree of political resolve on the Israeli side to continue this operation until Hamas is otherwise no longer of political or military influence in the Strip.
But timeline?
So, there are a number of mitigating factors. I mean, to have heard Israelis speak in the early days, you might have heard an Israeli military planner say, well, how long did it take the Americans to defeat ISIS? 5 years? And of course, people would say, you don't have 5 years. I mean, public pressure, the situation on the ground, this is not going to enjoy the same level of broad support. I think ultimately the types of operations that we're seeing now have months. But at the same time, something that I've talked about and I'm writing about and haven't really said too much publicly is what can and potentially should be happening in concert with Israel's operations on the front line is an international effort or a multinational effort to begin stabilization operations in areas that are otherwise secure or have been cleared from Hamas, because you can't kill your way to the defeat of an insurgency. If you assess there are 30,000 Hamas militants and you will begin your next phase once you have killed them, you will turn around and find, well, there are still 30,000 Hamas militants. What happened? So arresting that process of recruitment that is born in situations of suffering, and to say that people will literally just pick up the gun that is dropped by one militant, not because necessarily they even share or aspire to Hamas's specific ideology, but because they just generally find themselves in resistance to the Israeli force as an occupier or simply as a combatant in their homes and communities, that will occur unless there is an effort to fill the governance gap, the security gap, provide medical aid, and restore some semblance of normal civilian life in areas where it can be done, understanding that it will be a long time before that is actually realized, because there will need to be the clearance of rubble, the reconstruction of homes, dealing with the tunnel system, and then, frankly, a rebuilding of Gazan civil society and communities, which will take some time, but hopefully, again, is an opportunity for a regional effort that does, sort of implicate the broader region, including the Gulf. So we'll just have to see.
Okay, I'm stretching this out too long.
I apologize.
No, it's not you, it's
yeah,
me. It's usually I have a
concise.
problem with the speakers going on too long. This case is a problem with the moderator going on too long. My apologies. Omar, wrap up.
First of all, thank you to the organizers for this timely and apt discussion, which is important. I was asked to address the effect that the Abraham Accords have had on the kind of role and involvement of the GCC states in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over time, as well as the potential for GCC states to exert pressure for either a ceasefire or a durable solution. I think it goes without saying that normalization with Israel is not a policy of the GCC. It's a policy of individual states that are pursuing what they believe to be their national interest. And so in that sense, it's actually a point of division. I don't want to go as far as saying a point of contention. Dr. Sagar alluded to that it's not a point of contention in the GCC, but at least a point of division with the normalizing states, the UAE, Bahrain on one side, Kuwait on the other, and the Saudis and Qatar and Oman on another. Although, listening to Dr. Baabood and my own perception, it looks like Oman has, over the past 3 years, more shifted in the direction of Kuwait than the other way. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I think you saw that division put on display in the kind of comments that came out of the GCC states. Again, UAE and Bahrain issuing condemnation of Hamas, having that kind of tone as well, and calling for de-escalation, whereas Qatar and Kuwait were much more focused on the context that gave rise to October 7th without condemning Hamas, and the Saudis taking kind of a softer position, as was mentioned earlier. I think over the past month, those policies have evened out in the wake of just the unmitigated disaster that has unfolded in the Gaza Strip. And I don't know how we can discuss that in terms of Israel's operations here, in terms of kind of a targeted counterinsurgency, when 70% of those killed already, of the 11,000 killed, are women and children, let alone men who are also innocent civilians. And when you have collective punishment, cutting off food, water, medical supplies, electricity, fuel. So discussing that in terms of a targeted thing to root out Hamas, I think is a delusion, especially when we're talking about the end game, and I'll get to that eventually. But the horror of what has happened, I think, has affected the region. I don't like to look at states necessarily as cynical actors. Policymakers have pulses too as well. They also pursue their interests, of course, above other things. But But it was discussed at length here, and Dr. Tafur did, I think, a great job explaining the widespread indignation in the region and the popular anger at what's taking place and the pressure that's being mounted on governments here to take some kind of action in light of what's happening. So people are very angry. There's even a fear of where this is heading, that we're far from the end of this. All states, as was mentioned, in the region, I think, are concerned over escalation, over a wider escalation of this conflict, and I don't think anybody wants to see that, from Morocco to Iran. I think there's a concern over keeping this contained. But that point of contention extends even beyond the GCC to the wider region. We saw in the Organization of Islamic States, the Arab League conference that met, very strong rhetoric that came out, but very short on action points. And the reporting that came out around that, whether you trust it or not, was that those states that have relations with Israel, kind of pump the brakes on any type of action plan. I wanted to go into public opinion and the cost of normalization and that kind of stuff, but that's been talked about at length, so I'll skip ahead. But if we look at the involvement of the GCC states in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly on the Palestine issue in particular, I mean, obviously there's a very important historical role that the Gulf states have played of political support, of financial support, of hosting Palestinian population, even political organizing. Fatah, was founded in Kuwait. So you have that aspect. That there obviously wasn't the military side like other states played, but Saudi Arabia was key in centering the Palestinian issue in the international conversation, so that the Palestinian cause was not ignored within the conversation about the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And I think that was important over time. And that includes the UAE and Bahrain in their particular roles. Sheikh Zayed was very supportive of the Palestinian cause. I think over the past decade, with the UAE and Bahrain, I think that relationship, there are very parochial reasons for this that I can get into. That relationship with the PA, at least, had started to sour. And in the immediate run-up to the Abraham Accords, I think there was a perception that the Palestinian issue, if it didn't resonate as strongly as it once did, that the situation was stable enough, that the costs were low enough, that this line could be pursued. And what's crucial for the involvement of the Gulf in this conflict is that the drivers of normalization, and again, I mentioned the kind of national interests that were being pursued by these states, the drivers of normalization had to do with those national interests and not with the Palestinian cause, not with bringing peace to the Palestinian issue, despite the kind of rhetoric that, the framing of this whole thing. I think that was, just that, was rhetoric. It was not substantive in reality. And we can see that, motivations, why things come into being, why these relationships formed, is crucial in the outcome. Nothing has been done whatsoever over the past 3 years to advance, the Palestinian national agenda, to advance peace from the states that normalized with Israel. I mean, that's just a fact. That doesn't mean that nothing could have been done, but those kind of things would have required political will, effort on the part of those states, and whether they're willing to muster that it didn't seem to be the case, at least. Again, because let's be honest, the Israeli government and the Netanyahu government in particular would have opposed any effort by those states to advance the national interests of the Palestinian people. And so, again, that would require pushing back and expending political capital in that effort. So in a sense, the Abraham Accords have had a neutralizing effect on those states that have normalized to an extent. And it's also the same, I mean, if you look in some degree at other states that have relations with Israel. But those states must now balance their relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And when you're balancing a relationship between very asymmetrical parties, you're in a sense doing a service to the more powerful side. And Israel has used this relationship to pressure the Palestinians. I mean, that if you listen to Netanyahu himself and those around him, if you read the analysis that's produced by that side of the political spectrum within Israel, Netanyahu viewed in part normalization as a way to alienate the Palestinians from their traditional base of support in the region, to undermine the Palestinian cause to weaken resilience among Palestinians to the kind of oppression they face and the pressure they face to give up on their national claims. So that was a very motivating factor from the Israeli side of things. I think there is actually a passive consequence of normalization that gives a certain amount of leverage. And that's in the fact that this relationship has a cost for the states that normalize because of how unpopular, how demonized Israel is in the region. I mean, this was mentioned at length, in the kind of the battle for narrative between Iran and the Gulf states and all that kind of stuff. But, when you hitch your wagon to Israel, its popularity in the region is very low. It's very hated, especially in moments like this. And so that has a cost for the kind of image and status of those states that normalize with Israel in the region. It's not seen in the same way that it is in the United States. There's reasons for that, of affinity, of history, of culture, of religion with the Palestinian people, but there's also, people are much more aware of the kind of oppression that Palestinians face than Americans and Westerners, and we see on Al Jazeera much different than we see on CNN, and that's just a fact. So, I talk about a passive leverage in the sense that that cost makes things uncomfortable, especially in moments like this, as was mentioned. That Dr. Baabood talked about the embarrassment that's felt by states that have developed a relationship with Israel. Well, those states don't want to feel that embarrassment. They don't want to feel uncomfortable. They don't want to feel the pressure from their publics of having been put in this position. So that could kind of generate some type of interest in being more active in resolving the situation. But again, this is passive, not active issues there. I think the biggest point of leverage, actually, that came out of the Abraham Accords, ironically, is the threat of ending relations with Israel, right? That's the kind of card you have. I think it's perceived by Israel as actually not very credible, and there's a reason for that, because the relationship with Israel is not just a bilateral relationship with Israel. That relationship is underpinned by, and this is true of Egypt, of Jordan, of Morocco, of the Gulf states. It's underpinned by the relationship with the United States, and so there is a fear that if you go back on that relationship, if you exit the relationship with Israel, then it might harm your relationship with the United States, and that might be something that those states don't want to suffer. So in my opinion, overall, the kind of formalized relationships with Israel has not produced a great impact in terms of leverage and influence that these states have on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, Qatar, for example, is the most influential state by far in the region, in the GCC, on events within Gaza. And it doesn't have formal relations with Israel, but it has positioned itself over time to have that kind of power and influence by how it's developed relationships with the Israelis, with Hamas, et cetera. And so you don't need that particular relationship in order to have influence. I think Qatar has demonstrated that. When it comes to the issue of pressuring for a ceasefire or a durable solution, there was a lot of things said earlier and on the previous panel that I would argue with. I don't think many countries in the GCC have that type of leverage. I don't think anybody really does, even the United States to an extent, and that's a result of obviously our domestic politics here in the United States. But in order to pressure the Israelis to do something that they don't want to do is extremely difficult. And so expecting the UAE to be able to do that may be asking a bit much. There was an interesting article in the Times of Israel a few days ago in which they had interviewed, it was a very long article, it had interviewed some Arab ambassadors off the record, but we're quoting them. And they were expressing frustration with, the U.S. is now, the U.S. is very diplomatically engaged all of a sudden, Blinken, to find some kind of position here, and is saying, well, let's get the Gulf states and other Arab parties in here to start thinking about the end game and the day after and all that kind of stuff. And they're expressing their frustration with how can you discuss the end game when we don't, how can you discuss the day after when we don't know Israel's end game here? And you asked the question about, what's Israel's end game? They have one option, which is to, at some point declare victory and pull out. No, that's not an option, because who fills the void of governance? And this is the dilemma that Israel faces. there is a void of governance. If you don't, there's a reason they had a relationship with Hamas, and it was a tense relationship. It's one Palestinian scholar called, actually it's slipping my mind what he called it, but it's obviously not a healthy relationship or anything like that. But Israel had come to rely on Hamas both to govern the Strip and for political agenda purposes and ideological purposes. Netanyahu himself and Likud viewed Hamas as the perfect foil to divide the Palestinian the Palestinian polity and territorially. But there is no alternative, or there was no alternative for Hamas. So Israel's not just going to pull out at the moment. And so I think it's, and we can argue about this, but its goal is much more paradigmatic, much more in terms of a paradigm shift. And we can see that in terms of what it's doing. I mean, again, when we're talking about this counterinsurgency, I mean, how can we ignore the statements coming out of Israeli leaders across the political spectrum that are genocidal in tone, that are talking about erasing Gaza from the map in this particular moment, and are backed up by what we're seeing in terms of what they're inflicting on the people, which is a total war of death and destruction upon the civilian population, upon the infrastructure. And so I don't think the states in the GCC necessarily want to be a party to what Israel's doing. I don't think, and they're expressing this, I don't think they want to clean up, and Egypt too, clean up the mess that Israel's making because of the wanton death and destruction that they're inflicting on the Gaza Strip. Again, I mentioned the end game. Israel's not, it's not like Israel's coordinating with its partners on what that end game is. And so, there's an effect, we're talking about the PA going back in there. That's also an illusion, which I can get into. But I don't think the Gulf states want the PA effect. And the role of the PA today in the West Bank is absent a political process, because the Israelis made it clear they don't want a political process. Absent a political process, the PA is nothing but a subcontractor of the occupation, which is facilitating the further colonization of Palestinian land. And if the Gulf states or the Arab parties are to go in there without that political process in motion and just to govern and police resistance out of the Gaza Strip, then suddenly they're taking on the same role as the PA, which has lost all legitimacy among its own public, and is the reason the PA doesn't want to go back into the Gaza Strip on the back of an Israeli tank with no political process, with no prospect for a state of their own. And so what's the point of that? And so I think we're talking about the role of the Gulf states to get involved in the day after here without a real political process. And we can talk about international conferences aimed at a two-state solution, but they're completely divorced from the reality on the ground today, the ideological and political objectives of those in power in Israel, and the 700,000 to 800,000 settlers that exist, the inability to pull them out, and the dynamics within the Israeli political system that make peace along two states impossible today, or at least so highly improbable that we can discuss them in terms of impossibility. I want to say one more thing, if I have a second.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm not trying to say that the Gulf states can't play a role. And Dr. Ulrichsen said one thing that I totally agree with at the very end of his statements. The Gulf states have become real power players in the region, and they have a role. I mean, all these states, I don't want to say that nobody can play a role, that the Israelis are going to do whatever they want. You just have to think a little bit outside the box, be willing to exert pressure, be willing to use the leverage at your disposal. And it's not just leverage vis-a-vis the Israelis, but within the international system, within their own partners in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, China, to play a real role in resolving this. Because if not, everybody has the danger of regional instability, conflict, and all of that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Just
Jonathan,
to accentuate a couple of Omar's excellent points on the issue of Gulf and other states getting involved, absent a clear vision of that which would come next, which isn't just a return to a frozen or semi-frozen conflict. Currently, Ambassador Barbara Leaf, the Assistant Secretary of State for Nearest Affairs, along with Brett McGurk, a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for the Middle East, are in the region, and the principled message by which they see the vision moving forward: no forced displacement, no reoccupation, not a platform for terror, and no blocking of aid. But along those principles, working to develop some mechanism that which may come next. On the issue of the Israeli government, I've been in conversation with Israeli journalists. I had an event with Barak Ravid, actually on the role of media on this conflict. But the question did come up about whither the Israeli government in all of this. And ultimately, I think the movement and certainly the formation of a right-wing based government with Netanyahu being the most centrist character on it it is a foregone conclusion that it's going away and never coming back. So to even take statements from Bibi Netanyahu today about that which is going to occur on the day after, his uncomfortableness about Palestinian Authority governance in Gaza Strip or elsewhere or whatever, I would take with a very significant grain of salt that it's nice that he has opinions, but ultimately he's not going to be representing the Israeli political position in due course. So I would just, offer those points as well.
All right, we're clearly running out of time, and I have shamelessly grabbed a lot of it. But one quick question, and this would be, please consider this as the wrap-up. When we first began talking about the Abraham Accords and the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states, the American press, the Western press, so much of it concentrated on that the Abraham Accords were some sort of alliance against Iran. This seemed to have just, every time you would open the newspaper, it was a defensive alliance against Iran. It was a way of protecting the Gulf states against Iran. I spent a fair amount of time talking to people in the Gulf, and I have not met a single one of them who would really want to go to war with Iran or to be dragged into a war with Iran. Is this misconception dead now? Is it dead in the water that it is not a defensive alliance against Iran, or is it something that can prevent further normalization? And again, I'd like to sort of treat this as you're talking, all four of you, as you're talking about this, if you could just add a finishing sentence for each for the program that I've allowed to run over. Let's take it from the beginning. Dr. Abdulla?
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed listening to my colleagues. Well, let's put it this way. Iran is a regional country, so is Israel. And I think all the Gulf states, and Turkey, of course, as well, all the Gulf states want to live in peace with these countries. And I don't think anybody in the Gulf has, the conception of going to war with Iran. There is no reason for it. We might have different opinions. We might have different way of looking at things, but I don't think anybody wants to go to war with Iran. Iran obviously is going through its own phase of revolution. In the beginning, it started to call for export of revolution and all of that. But I think that has now all changed. And I think Iran wants to coexist with the Gulf states and want to collaborate with the Gulf states. And it sees its benefit through negotiation, through dialogue, through diplomacy, rather than through conflicts. I think Iran, some of the policies that we've created here in the Gulf states, and also instigated by our Western allies, have empowered Iran in many ways and emboldened it. We've given Iraq to Iran. We've given Syria to Iran. We've given Lebanon to Iran. We've given Yemen to Iran. And now we're giving Palestine and Hamas to Iran. It's just because of our own mistakes of not knowing how to conduct our own policies and have our own priorities right. So I think at the end of the day, Iran now realizes that it wants to live within the region. It has its interests. Of course, it can pursue its interests, but as long as that is pursued in a diplomatic and, of course, an acceptable ways in relations between states in the region, then it is accepted. I just want to add something, if I may, if you allow me, and that is, I think many people are talking about the Gulf states, contributing to the reconstruction cost in Gaza. And I think they will. But let me just add something to that. I think we are also overestimating of how much the Gulf states can contribute and longer to conflicts in the region. The Gulf states are now facing their own economic challenges. They have their own visions. They are focusing on their economic diversification. And they've got a lot on their plate. They've got Yemen, they've got Iraq, they've got Syria, they've got Lebanon, and now they've got Gaza, and they've got Sudan. So I think we've got to be very careful in expecting that the Gulf states are going to do that. I think this is where, comes to your question, the Gulf states don't want another conflict in the region. And I want to tell another thing, just to kind of end with that. This conflict didn't start on the 7th of October. We've got to actually learn from the history. We've got to learn from our mistakes. And normalization with the Gulf states or any other country is not going to resolve the problem. The main issue is the Palestinian question. What is Israel going to do with that? Does it have a solution for it? Does it have a vision of where they wants to deal with the Palestinian issue? Unless you do that, you can't get rid of Hamas, and you will get other organizations that are even more powerful, perhaps, than Hamas in the future. And the conflict is not going to end. We want to end the conflict. We want to have Israel as part of this region. But Israel doesn't want to be part of this region, obviously, because it doesn't want to end the conflict in the region. And it knows, everybody knows, that the Palestinians have got to have their right. And it's not just a matter of, increasing settlements and giving them aid and economic prosperity. They have their own national aspiration. They want their own state. Is Israel willing to do that? Or is Israel willing to include them all in one state? This is the question that Israel has to answer. It can't have its own cake and eat it at the same time. Thank you.
Dr. Farmanfarmaian?
Thank you. I think I'd like to start by trying to go back and have a look or just ask what Hamas's motivation was on October 7th. And I think if we consider that, it becomes less Israel's war and more a question of recognizing what the Abraham Accords were showing to Hamas and the axis of resilience, if you want to call it that, of Iran, which was Palestine had been taken off the agenda. It simply wasn't being considered. It was being sidelined. For example, in the UN, Netanyahu had shown a map of Israel only a few months before that did not even include Palestine. And I think if one answers my question as simply as possible, one of the answers might simply be that it put the Palestinian question back on the map very strongly and possibly showed one version of an outcome, and that outcome is Israel's future lies only through Gaza and the Palestinians. It will not be able to be a nation at peace until it solves that problem. And I agree with you, Abdulla. I think it's shown so far it's not willing to be part of the region because it's not solving that problem, but in fact it's not seeing its own future as defined by that problem. So if that is the one answer, and if you're agreeing with my perspective, then I think it becomes very clear that, of course, Iran knew all about this whole problem and the timing and when it would take place and the planning. And I think it is one of the issues that Gulf states are weighing at the moment. This was a threshold moment on October 7th, not only because it showed how unprepared the Israeli army was at a time when we thought it was invincible and had been invincible for decades, but it showed American intelligence was also failing and has consistently failed when it has come to the axis of resilience and what they do. And I have to say, it's one of the benefits I have as a professor in Cambridge, because I read the dissertations about the communications between these different groups. And they are not being easily tracked. They are not something that is being picked up. A lot of it is human intelligence that is exchanged in small groups all the time. And these are groups that move. That's what militias do. That's what the communication through mosques do. And so I think we have to recognize that this has been a moment of enormous cost. I agree with you. A lot of the Abraham Accords is a relationship between Israel and the United States plus whatever country is seeing it in their interest to sign that. But what we're seeing is U.S. it's an increasing cost to the United States. It has cut off its relations with several groups and countries in that region. It cannot negotiate. It cannot go to the table. And so it's having to hand that over, not only to Qatar, which I agree is doing a consistently amazing job, but also to countries like China and Russia, who can talk to everybody, and specifically to Turkey. I think the relationship between Iran and Turkey is constantly one of those on the balancing wheel, but they nonetheless have found a mechanism by which to almost be Laurel and Hardy half the time in the region by arguing different sides of a narrative that's never coming to the United States. I have to say it's one of the things sitting as an American in Europe, and I feel as though the narrative here is so starkly different than what we are reading in the papers and in the, conferences such as this and in the government's negotiations and talks and statements. It is a different world, and you go one more step from Europe over to the Middle East, and it's a completely different narrative. And I think the degree of popular outrage at the moment is very misunderstood here, certainly is something among the population of leadership. It is perhaps less misunderstood among our own populations on the streets, which is why we're seeing the level of demonstrations at the moment sweeping the world that are so pro-Palestinian. They're not being well explained in our Western media. Why is this happening? It's because it's on social media. It's a media that's shared by those on the Middle East, also in the streets. This is something that needs to be addressed by our leadership if we're going to realize that it's not just those naval numbers that you've described. Those, if anything, are, for example, I would say, a further cost to the United States, because along with all of those incredible military hardware is 5,500 deaths of children in the streets of Israel and Palestine, and that is not going to be forgotten. And I go back to what you said, Danya, the post-colonial narrative is surprisingly strong at the moment. This is a moment as strong as the Arab Spring, but it's not directed against the leadership of the Arab world. It's directed against the West. And I really see that coming down as two very separate narratives.
Thank you. We're really running out of time.
Sorry
I'm
to
going
be
to
so
be
emotional.
quite unfair to Jonathan and Omar. You've each got a minute and a half, and I got 30 seconds after that. Please.
I guess I'll address the thing you brought up about the Abraham Accords. I don't know how I'm going to do it in a minute and a half, but and this is with respect to Jonathan, because he was talking about how the Abraham Accords were flourishing and normalization. It was so strong, and I've written pretty extensively about how that, in my opinion, that's the opposite of the case. Since 2020, when the Abraham Accords were signed, and since Trump left office, there's been no movement on the Abraham Accords. There's been a deepening, for sure, of the economic relationship, social relationship between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel itself. But the accords themselves have not expanded whatsoever in the region. Yes, there was momentum in the few months before October 7th on the Saudi file, but there are reasons for that separate from, what do you call it? This was, a momentum that was coming out of Washington and its sense of rivalry with China and the need to kind of prevent, especially in light of the BRICS and all these other things, prevent Saudi from moving into the Chinese orbit, much less than the kind of the benefits that these countries see in the relationship with Israel. In fact, it's more of a cost. But what happened after 2020, and this has to do with what you said in terms of it being a defense pact with Iran rather than a peace agreement, which in a sense I agree with. I think the primary motivation for the Gulf states at least is their securing their relationship with the United States, and I think Israel is seen as a conduit to that to an extent. But the Iran point of view is definitely a national interest for states like the UAE. Sheikh Najla mentioned how the UAE sees Iran and its relationship and trying to find ways at living together and finding de-escalation. And I think one thing that Jonathan didn't mention, and it was ignored, but it's so important, is how come the Gulf states, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, had a rapprochement with Iran in 2022 and 2023. There are reasons for that, and it's because this approach of ratcheting up tensions with Iran is a failure. Because at the end of the day, Iran used its proxies to attack Saudi oil fields in a limited fashion, but as a demonstration that, hey, you're on the front lines. And did the United States come to protect you in that instance? No, it did not. And so these states, I think, alarm bells were ringing and came to the realization that we need to resolve this situation ourselves with Iran, find a way of de-escalating our tensions with Iran, and that is a much more, from their point of view, I think, a stable, we don't know where it's ultimately going, as Sheikh mentioned, but and if that's going to succeed. But at the same time, the coalition building with the United States and Israel to pressure Iran, maximum pressure and all that kind of stuff, was very dangerous, I think, to the region. And I think there's a recognition of that by those Gulf states.
You set me up perfectly, Omar. Thank you. I think everyone has had a difficult neighbor. And living next to a difficult neighbor, you seek peace, you seek quiet, you seek to placate that neighbor because you don't want craziness on your front lawn. March 2023 was a very interesting moment because in the same week, literally within 24 hours, the Wall Street Journal was reporting the negotiations ongoing between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States on normalization. And I think perhaps it was the following day, it was that Friday, I can't remember the exact date, when it was publicly announced in Beijing the agreement, the trilateral agreement between China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And so I'm not predisposed to the idea that this is a binary, that the Gulf is choosing one, east, west. These things can and are happening in parallel, and for good reason. I think from again, there are experts here. I wouldn't presume to come close to your knowledge, but as an outside observer, what is occurring in Saudi Arabia is an effort to placate, find a sense of calm with a neighbor that has otherwise been difficult, while at the same time building relations, not just on the economic front, but certainly on the economic front, but on the security file that would then otherwise enable it through its partnerships and through its own military capabilities to be able to neutralize the threats that that very difficult partner presents. So those things can very much happen in parallel. And I think that's ultimately what is occurring. Emiratis go to sleep every night under the protection of not one now, but two Israeli air defense systems. Saudi Arabia has more American-provided air defense per capita than any other nation in the world. The coming advent that is being pressed for by the United States in the region of a regional security architecture that brings the best capabilities of all of America's partners together to otherwise deter, neutralize, and prevent the emergence of shared threats is mutually beneficial. And it also doesn't have to be specific. We don't have to get a narrative of who's at fault, but if everyone feels more secure in the region, that's a stabilizing force. So again, I would shy away from the binary. I think there are benefits for the region in engaging both East and West, and they don't necessarily have to come at direct cost to each other.
Well, thank you all very much. I will make one last comment. It's been a fascinating discussion, and what I find most fascinating is that I don't disagree with the closing remarks of any of our four panelists. Thank you all very much. Thank you.